Welcome back, everyone. This is the Biggening Corporation, and we are doing Business Central Development live streaming. For those of you who are new to this, we are creating an incremental game using Business Central functionality and engine, where players will use bots to generate transactional data, build their wealth, and that wealth will be measured up against other players on a seasonal basis to see who can create the most wealth per season. So, today, we left off yesterday on a cliffhanger. We had a bit of functionality that we wrote that was erroring out, and we need to fix that, of course. So we will do so. It is a very simple and small thing, but incredibly important, and ties together with what we discussed yesterday about transactions. But today is going to be a little different from some of our previous episodes. We spent a lot of each episode so far diving into the code, and we have hit the moment that is incredibly common for professional developers in our industry to hit. We have hit the point where we as developers are making a great deal of assumptions and decisions based on the story we've been handed, but a story in this case that isn't a specification. So let's real quick fix the issue that we were running into yesterday, which is here we are in our test player company, and we had our heartbeat service cruising along, trying to take its appropriate actions. Let's go to the correct job queue table here. Job queue entries. We have our heartbeat listener, and that was getting an error about cal functions are limited during write transactions because tables are locked. Well, nice and easy on that one. I spoke to the issue, but then failed to code around the core problem. So, where we had left off yesterday, we have our bot dispatcher running as a job, and for each of the bots, we are attempting to run with our error catching, run this code unit BCS bot purchase, and we call .run, and then we do some things afterwards. But within that code unit, if we look at the source code for it, which if you didn't know, you can usually right-click and go to definition. But in our case, this is the main trigger, so we have to actually go to the definition for the code unit itself. Here we are. And our code unit on run is doing the following things. It is really just setting a variable and returning the result of that variable. We are not making any write transactions. We are not changing any records in the database. So I admit I thought we were all safe and fine. We were ready to go and ready to test that out. And then immediately after the run call, whether it worked under this section or it did not work, one of the very first things and only things we are doing is we are doing a write transaction. We are inserting to the database. Well, you can use codeunit.run, but not while you're in the middle of an uncommitted transaction. The possibility of an error during this run call requires you to be between transactions so that the run can successfully roll back that transaction. Which means that in our case, we need to, after we've done the run, whether it worked or didn't work, we need to tell the dispatcher here that it should notify the services at the end here that we are done with that write transaction. And the way we do that, which you need to be very careful with, is this commit function. The moment we call this, nothing can be undone automatically by the system. If something goes wrong and we want to handle that, we have to do all of the heavy lifting ourselves. So in our run through this handle bots of type, if one of the bots hits a problem, and we commit that problem, and everything continues to move forward, if we then debug this and run it again, it will treat it as an entirely new run, but any changes we've made previously will stick. So it is dangerous to use commit. You should always be conscious of what possible transactions have hit before you call it. So I may on Twitter link, there's a delightful YouTube series that I was watching with my son yesterday where he talked about the onosecond, spelled as this, the onosecond, that instantaneous moment where you realize in a split second after you've done something that the only thing you can possibly do is go, oh no. Whenever you're putting a commit in your code, you are opening yourself up to oh no seconds. So be very careful. Always be thoughtful of it. In our case, we are only doing write transactions now to logs. But if we, say, 5 episodes from now, do a great deal of changes, deleting vendors, customers, and all those sort of things during this on-run, during this purchase code unit, well, all of those changes will be committed. And the next time we run it, they'll be committed all over again. So that will fix our heartbeat. So let's go ahead and publish that fix so we can see in just a moment or two that that is working okay. And away we go. That taking a moment, as always, with the first publish of the day. Great. Now we can come back here and refresh, make sure we're all up to date. The job queue will do that anyways, but that's fine. Job queue entries. And here we have the heartbeat listener in our player company. We can go ahead and set that back to ready. And this should run within a moment or so, and then we will have some entries. And we still have our error from the job queue probably has not updated the object in its side just yet, since we're still getting the same error message. So we'll come back to that, give it a few minutes, and then we'll reset the job. So let's get on to today's primary goal. As mentioned, we have been developing against what I would classify as a story, not a specification. In requirements engineering, story has some very specific terms. I am not a trained requirement engineering person, but I think it's valuable to think of the what we've looked at as our plan so far. It is an explanatory narrative. We are explaining what we want. However, that does not address all of the unspoken questions, and that is incredibly common for us to deal with as developers. We often get people handing things to us to go ahead and work on, where a lot of the assumptions have been made by the person writing the specification, and that those assumptions have not made it into here. It is very easy to do if you're doing bespoke solutions specific for a customer. If a consultant or a project manager is sitting in a room with someone and they hear all of the context and the story of why a change is being made to a sales order, it is easy to forget to include some of those key elements. So that's sort of what we have going on here today, and I specifically left this for us to run into. For one, I wasn't going to write a specification for this project. That would probably be a 50 to 70 page document, not a 6-page one. But there are lots of things in here that we have talked about that are simple pieces of information that have big implications. For example, we had in previous episode talked about the fact that bots come in different tiers and they will cost various materials. We'd highlighted that previously as that right there is a huge amount of requirements. Well, when we're talking about different tiers, what does that mean? How many tiers? Are we talking 1, 2, 3, 400? Is that something that players can make? And those sort of questions are going to plague us throughout the specification. Some of that is because it wasn't decided. Some of that is it would be maybe impossible to know at the time of the creation of the document. More often than not, it's things people haven't thought of. One of the frameworks that we work with a lot in development is that data, when customers are asking us to add something, they don't know how to phrase what they're asking or think about it in a good way. As developers, we often have database engines where we have to support create, update, create, read, update, and delete. Basic CRUD operations is how they're often called. And because that is something that is native to what we do, that is a very valuable way to frame some of the questions that we should be asking in the specification. For example, if we are doing something as simple as maybe adding an anniversary date to a customer card, is this the person across from the table, the consultant has said, we want to know when a customer's anniversary is. Okay. Who will enter that? Are we importing? Is that manual? How does that get created? Is that something that gets set when we create a new customer? Does that get set automatically? What do we do with all the existing ones? On the reading side of things, what value is this data? Who should see it? What systems should that drive? Should it be possible to delete this? Is it possible or allowed to update it? All of these questions, when you think about them in this framework of how does it get created? Who reads it? For what purpose is this additional information? When will this information change? When will this information go away? If you have this idea in your head when you're reading specifications, you create the space for yourself to ask important questions. So, if we come back to our story, the core concept to this game was that they can only use bots to do things. Well, okay, if we come down here and we see, we're going to have sales order bots. The bots are assigned to create sales order for items. Bots will act as representative to customers. Whoa, there's a lot in there. If we look at the thought process behind there is the player allowed to create customers themselves? No, as we've kind of chitter-chattered about a little bit as asides, in the back of my mind when I wrote the specification, they do not get to choose that. They do not get to create that. So that means that the create responsibility is entirely on some process that we are coding. That is now our responsibility. And that's a big responsibility. We have to think about that. The same thing happens on the purchase side. The same thing will happen on the item side. There is a huge amount of implication to the fact that players can't do the work. That means that all the things a person would normally do in an ERP system, we have to take into account. We have to plan for. And on top of this, we are trying to gamify the system, and we are trying to gamify it in a way that people are going to potentially be competitive against each other. Players are going to be looking for what strategies can I use to play it differently. We are not creating a visual novel type scenario where you unlock bot A to unlock technology B to unlock bot C and straight line progression. We want players to have some variability to how they play. Otherwise, everyone would be in the same point. It's just who hits the buttons fastest. And that's not a very interesting piece. So, the measure by which we are valuing a player's success is just one: wealth. Well, the only way that we are creating a scenario right now that players can generate wealth is through sales against purchases. A pretty typical way of generating wealth, to be fair. So that means that the primary ways that players can differentiate themselves will have to be in that sales and purchasing side of the flow, and potentially to some small extent, because we are creating the artificial drains on wealth of the expenses between this process, we need to also give them some flexibility of how that drain happens. So back in our our bot creation wizard episode, I kind of mentioned that I think there's a lot of value to providing some unexpected results, some variability to how do customers come into being. And rereading through the specification, we've hit this delightful, wonderful moment as developers where we go, the story doesn't tell us enough. So I have the advantage of I'm the customer here as well as the developer, so I can ask me, what, from a game development point of view, what exactly do you want that to look like? So for a customer organization to exist, to a vendor organization to exist, how do we want to have that work? How do we want there to be variability and the ways that players can potentially do different things? So I thought about the process and the workflow of some of the different bots and how can we do this. And I think it would be valuable to split, unlike the ERP system, we're going to split the customer and sales side to be a little bit different than our vendor supplier side. Customers will be buying items at all of the different tiers, which, as we talked about, I've got some rough idea of the classes in mind of how some of these materials might look. This list keeps coming back up and we will expand on that today. The customers will buy at all the different class levels, but we are going to be doing assemblies and later manufacturing, and all of that will be from the raw materials. So vendors are always just going to be somehow or another supplying parts at this class level for now. So we have to take slightly different strategies. So I've roughly sketched my idea that we need a workflow of how do customers come into our system. And for digital whiteboarding and really rough flow charting, Word Smart Art actually works really nicely for that. We can do some basic process flows with that, so I'm going to make use of that mechanic here. We have in our organization sales bots that can connect to a customer account. That's right in our story that each bot will act as a representative. We also can see that it does not say that each bot acts as the representative or a sole representative. Whoops, and it helps if I look in the right section up here in sales, not purchase. So that implies that we could potentially, because it's not specifically forbidden, as a developer we could decide that we could say maybe 20 bots can service the same customer organization. Well, that's an interesting idea. And if multiple bots can select multiple items in larger orders and whatnot, that implies that we could have an army of bots representing a single customer organization that buys over and over and over again from us. I think that's interesting. I actually think there's a lot that we can work with there, but then that brings us around to, but should the customer have restrictions? Anytime we're dealing with a gaming decision, we can always rely on a wonderful question that I love from Let's Game It Out, delightful YouTube series. Is there a limit? And I think there should be, because it would not be very interesting of a game if a player could go ahead and buy 600, 700, 800, 5,000 bots against a single customer. I don't think that would be very interesting at all. So that implies that we need to introduce a limit, and we need some variance to those customers. But how do we acquire them then? In our wizard episode, we talked about the possibility that when we buy a sales bot, right at that moment in time, we present the player with some possible variations and options. And I think that's not a bad idea, but that idea works well only in the context of a bot being the sole representative of a customer entity. And I don't think that gives us as much flexibility and as much opportunity for fun. For example, we have marketing bots, and I had the idea and vision in the spec here that marketing bots will generate campaigns. Okay. It may decrease prices, maybe it increases demand for items, but that's a very, very narrow focused job, and I don't think it best represents how we might be able to utilize this. So what I was thinking that the workflow could be is that we could have marketing bots that if they're assigned to find customers, their ops per day is the number of potential customers that we can add. I think that's a lot of fun, because then we have the ability to we have, as the player, the ability to choose, do I have a very small number of customers, do I have a large number of customers, and we have some variability there. We've now given some framework for players to differentiate their strategy from one season to the next. Now, when it comes to each customer, now we have to have the ability to assign a bot to it, but as we saw, we might want to assign bots to it. And if we're answering the is there a limit, we now at the customer level, for our gaming's sake, need to introduce not necessarily something as simple as a credit limit, which has its merits, but I was thinking that it would be good if customers have a max orders per day as well as a max quantity per order. And that way we have now a way to potentially differentiate customers. We might have a customer that the marketing bot finds that has a very low number of orders per day, but it will order in huge batches. Or we might want to have a customer that orders very small batches but does lots of little orders, so we can shop those out to different locations. So there's some variability that we now create for ourselves just by adding this small bit of things. We also have the framework where we can have customers be restricted to certain item classes. Maybe this customer only buys the raw materials. Maybe this customer wants to buy assemblies and you need to get moving on starting to produce some of those assemblies. So I think there's value to that as well. Like maybe you want to focus your efforts on, growing your organization huge, doing buying and trading in massive volumes of simple parts. And then finally, once the customer has been selected, that's when the sales bots can do the order creation. Create order creation. Typing and talking at the same time. And I think that is a workflow of customer acquisition and fulfillment makes more sense than what we've loosely outlined so far. That you buy a bot, it's a sales bot, here's a customer to go with it, ta-da, that's the end. And I think it would be a lot of fun that we can introduce more layers to some of this customer area. For example, this whole section where it max orders per day, max quantity per order, could vary by bot tier. We talked about how bots will come in different tiers. Well, what does that mean? They different complexity, different speed. Well, this is another way that we can really benefit by building off of that tiered bot concept. Maybe marketing bots that are tier 2 are able to find bigger customers that provide faster value, bigger value, and this allows us to more naturally flow in game development. I think that's going to be a lot of fun. We may go ahead and also do some consideration of discount percentages. Maybe customers that do larger orders will require you to offer discounts to them to be able to do business with them. So we could have fun with that. But that's a maybe. I'm not sure that provides a huge amount of value to us, but it might. So now that we've got this flow, we can say, okay, well, now we have a much more dynamic way that players can structure how they want to move forward. None of this is in the specification. None of what we originally were starting to design was in the specification. So if you are in the development industry or trying to become into the development industry, this would be the sort of moment where when you hit that realization that what you're trying to make, you are the one suddenly making decisions on behalf of the customer. This is the moment where you talk to your project manager or the customer and you say, we need to spend a little additional time to kind of map out your expectations here. And in so doing, maybe we spend a little more time than anyone originally thought, but it will be what you expect, and you can budget for that change. Some companies do this via a change request process. Some people it's a little less formal, but it's still the point at which you need to do this. You will also find, if you are working in the industry, that sometimes projects are behind schedule and it's almost too late to ask these questions. So it's very important as developers to get practice at reading the specifications and identifying those shortcomings, any loopholes or missing pieces early in the process, so that way the customer isn't in a place of why isn't it done yet. They should still be in the headspace of let's set the expectation. That can be very, very important. So if that works really well from the sales side, how do we want to handle the vendor side? Do we want to do the same thing? I don't think we do. I think having marketing bots finding us suppliers doesn't make as much sense. How do we want to potentially find better suppliers? Well, my thinking on this strategy, if we go to a new little page here and we do the same workflow, my thinking on this one is that this will all be in the operation of the purchasing bot, all within that workflow of just that bot, and that we will go through some different stages rather than handoff between different steps. Let's see. It doesn't really matter what we're choosing for some flow here. I think there is benefit to all of them, but let's go with sure. Doesn't matter. So my thinking is that when you acquire a purchase bot, it is unassigned. Actually, let's do this. There we are. When you get a purchase bot, it is unassigned. And when it is unassigned, we don't need to provide our own bullets, do we? When it is unassigned, the ops per day will find suppliers. And this gives us the ability to say that when we're doing the find mode, that the tier of the bot drives the quality of the vendors we find. So much like the marketing tier can find us better customers that maybe provide bigger orders per day or bigger quantity per order, we can kind of simplify this on the purchasing side and flatten it out a little bit and say that the purchase bots that are unassigned will try to find new suppliers for us, and the way that those vendors will look, much like on the customer side, we will introduce a new max orders per day, and we will introduce a max quantity per order. One of the other things that we spoke to is, let's see, we talked about market demand having an impact on things. In later waves, what we can do is we can also have market demand drive some of the supplier side logic. Not in version 1. I don't think that sounds like a good idea, but always good to note your second version ideas down. You will want them back someday, so jot them down. So for our vendors, the supply and demand pricing of what sort of price points do they tend to do. But for our version 1, what we can choose is which base materials. So for example, a purchaser bot might find a great new supplier for our generic metal parts, but it's only giving us a good deal on just metal parts, whereas they might find a generic supplier that supplies all of the different parts, but maybe at not so high of a volume. So I think there's some playability with that. I think that will potentially give us some structure by which we can, on the supply side, make there be some bottlenecks. That way a player has an incentive to go ahead and not just assume that their primary one vendor that they've made can supply all of their demand for the next 20 years. So that gives us an interesting map of things that aren't even remotely in the workflow today. That also lets us know a few different things. We are going to need to give the player, right from the very start, a marketing, a sales, and a purchase bot, because otherwise they will potentially not find any customers or vendors. Great. So that's a whole bunch of information. I like it. So now we have a little more info that we'll be coding against. And now, what else do we need to think about? We have talked about that there will be different classes of items. Again, there's not a lot in the specification, or story in this case, that there are basic items, but there are some items that are assemblied in kits, and then there are even higher items that will be manufactured. So we're going to, as we reflected in the some of the posting groups, we are going to stick to this theme of we are going to have simple parts, and then we'll have the assembled parts, and then we are going to have manufactured parts. So let's elaborate on this a little bit. Let's bring this back over into our structure, just kind of our word whiteboard, as it were. So we talked about having the simple parts, which are class 1 items, and we'll go ahead and bring these over. So, and bullet points, please. Thank you. And then we will have, for nomenclature, I'm going to call these improved parts. I like improved. Sounds good. And what we are going to do is these are primarily going to be kits made of other things. So, for example, maybe we have a chair kit. and later we're going to have a little spreadsheet or a table somewhere where we kind of outline all the different components. But a chair kit in our case, let's say for example this is a standard office chair and it uses maybe, I don't know, 5 metal parts and 3 fabric parts. So we're going to need, for all of these improved parts, to define what are the pieces that comprise this item. If you are not familiar with the assembly system in Business Central, let's pop over there for a second, because we haven't spent hardly any time in any Business Central environment today. And I went to Master. I actually want to go to Cronus for once. This part confuses a variety of people. If we go over to our item list, they've done a pretty good job of items. Jeez, they've done a pretty good job of trying to fix up some of the nomenclature around items. So, for example, the assembly functionality that is in here was originally a North American kitting functionality. It was designed to be simple goods that you didn't want to track the amount of time and effort it took to put things together in the box and get them on the truck. You didn't need to do a whole production orders or things like that. It was just a nice way of collectively selling an item. So for example, if we look at this whiteboard kit, this is an assembly bill of materials, BOM. Some folks boom, some folks bomb, depends on where you're from. But this is an item that is automatically comprised of a list of other items. And if we look in here in the replenishment, this is replenishment based on assembly. The replenishment system is going to be something we're not going to be making a whole lot of use of ourselves, but it is a heck of a powerful engine for customers to decide how are they going to refill their stock, and this will drive the how. Are they buying it? Are they producing it? Are they transferring it from a location? Or are they doing assemblies? And in our case, we're doing an assembly. If we look at the assembly bill of materials for this, it is good. A simple list that says, okay, let's take the Atlanta whiteboard base, one piece of it, just an each, and let's take 1 can of yellow paint. That's it. We take this whiteboard and we make it yellow. And you'll note there's no logic around this as to like time or anything like that. And assemblies can contain other assemblies. You'll notice that we have that here. So from our perspective, what we're going to be doing is we're going to have a list just like that, where we say we're going to use a metal parts and we're going to use 5 each of them. As mentioned early on in the stream, we are sticking with eaches across the board. I am not going to try to do unit of measure conversions. We get into too many crazy rounding problems for bots to handle, I think. But anyways, so for example, if we tell the system that we are going to sell to a customer 10 chair kits, and that item is configured correctly, then we will get an assembly posted automatically to consume 50 of the metal parts and 30 of the fabric parts. So we're going to eventually need to create an appropriate home for the master list of all the different improved parts. I think for our sanity's sake, for the tech tree later on, I will probably further subdivide these part lists into maybe categories of items. I didn't have anything in my specification as of yet for the item category codes. I think it might be fun for our tech tree to have the research bots have something to do, to go ahead and break down things into different consumer goods categories. For example, office, outdoors, storage, and that sort of thing. And we also had talked about that bots, it would probably be good, and we coded support for it, to be somewhat upgradable. If you recall, back in our bot instance, which if we come on back here, we created a code reference for power upgrades and operation upgrades. Well, again, that's another case of, I don't think there was a significant amount of notation in here. We talked about how we can potentially unlock different technologies, and we talked about upgrading research bots for different tiers, but I don't know if we specifically said anything about upgrades within beyond. We did not clarify between upgrading tiers versus whether or not we are installing upgrade code units. We've added that to our specification. So already, if we were to try to use this document to write help about how the game works, we're already falling short, and that's going to potentially be a problem. We do want to do documentation at some point for players who are starting. So we have these upgrade codes and operations upgrade code. How does that relate? I'm thinking that we are going to have in the different categories, in the different classes here, class 2 items, that we will have an improved processing kit that can be installed into robots. And that way it's within the player's ability to order their team to assemble improved parts, these improved processing kits, and then to install them into the bots within their systems. And that way they can choose to consume some of these parts and invest that into their bots. I think that'll be a lot of fun. So for example, the improved processing kit, maybe this add +1 operation per day. And maybe to build this, it requires, say for example, a robot kit plus, let's call it 5 simple circuits. Something like that. We would figure it out. We'll do some load balancing as to how do we want the assembly of these. But you'll notice that we can go ahead and say that we are, in this kit, going to require a separate kit. I like the idea of chaining some of these costs. I think that'll be fun. So we'll also do an improved power kit, and maybe what that'll do is reduce the power cost per day, which again, we'll call it a robot kit. And for this, we'll say maybe we want to use one simple circuit and also 4 power components. Wow. Okay, so this starts to give us an idea of we are going to need to create some home for a lot of different data. If we start to look at the manufactured items, which I haven't written up, just some loose sketches, we might at some point then say that the manufactured ones, if we do advanced circuits, maybe this takes some metal plus plastic plus a simple circuit. Who knows? We will figure out how those work, but then maybe down the road we would have an advanced processing kit, actually an advanced processing upgrade. Yeah, so we'll go ahead and copy that here because I think that's a better. Whew. A lot of selection shenanigans. So we could have the processing upgrades in a similar sort of way require the hierarchy before it. So we would say an improved processing upgrade plus something. And for the manufacturing side, instead of looking at the assembly bill of material, which if we look here, let's see, what menu do we hide you under here? Item. Nope. Okay. One of the things that I appreciate is that under the bill of materials, they have gone ahead and updated this to be assembly versus production to clarify things. And you'll see throughout the system that they tried to relabel the bill of materials to match that. I'm very thankful for that. So production is our manufacturing engine, and a production bill of material is a different thing. This can be a lot more complex. We can have different versions. We can have items on it that we can potentially do other production bill of materials. We can do things like having scrap percentages, which we're not going to play with. I think that'll create too much rounding, but it's an option. And also when things are planned out for production, I believe I'm trying to remember exactly where it's hiding. Always good. There's also then something called a routing for this item that drives how the operations are to produce this item, which I'm going to. So if we look at the routings, so for example, the routing on a bicycle here, this has processing steps, and this is where those bots are going to come in that are going to operate as our manufacturing bots, and those have different times and how much time is involved in setting up and how much is running and that sort of thing. So that will be our constraint in the manufacturing side. I want to have that manufacturing rely on a mix of simple and assembled parts. That way we're never completely leaving one part of the game to be gone. And I think here in the manufactured series, we'll still once again be able to do some different item categories where we might do home goods, kitchen, where we do different pieces, pans from metal and things like that. We can get into some different fabrication requirements and things. Not all the items will require the assembly level. I think it's fine if we do manufacturing straight from simple parts. So, having talked through all of these ideas, what do we do next? Okay, well, let's come on down to a little empty space here. Again, just using Word as a whiteboard since none of you are in the room with me. So we now know that we potentially need logic to generate customers from marketing operations. For example, if a player has 50 marketing bots that are each doing 4 operations per day, does that mean that they have 200 customers to pick from? That'd be a little frightening. Maybe because they have so many, they have a better quality. But not only do we have to have logic to generate customers, but that means that we need to have space for potential customers to exist. Do we want that to be contacts, maybe? I think it could be. That potentially is a nice way of differentiating these. And then we need a way for players to choose which potentials become customers. And since we're disconnecting the bots, the sales bots, from the customer during the creation of the bot process, we need a way for players to assign sales bots to customers. Players also need more insight into customer limits. The max per day order. So for example, we're going to need some changes to the customer list to expose the more relevant data to them, which also means that data needs to be on the customer. So there's a lot that we're getting out of just that first little diagram. And we are going to need to have a way that we need storage for customer item classes. What items do they buy? We need to have, let's see, I think that's pretty good for the sales side for the moment. No, I missed one. We need some settings for marketing bots. Are they boosting sales or finding customers? We need to have some means by which the player can decide which is more valuable for their situation. Then, coming out of the list for our sales workflow, let's go ahead and label that. And then coming out of the sales side, we have the purchasing side, where we have a similar sort of work list where we need to say, okay, we need settings maybe on the purchase bots assigned to vendor or finding new ones. We need, let's see, what else here? We need the same maximums per day and everything like that on the vendor side that we had on the customer, which also then player needs to see that. Player needs more insight to vendor limits. Same sort of flow there. Okay. And then now we start to get into the biggest thing, which is a lot of the inventory side of things and items. We need to have somewhere in the master company items along with assembly bill of materials and production bill of material routing information. We need to have all of that in there. If players are going to have a consistent experience and it's going to be fair space for them to be battling along, then that master company item table should also have common price starting point. How much does their demand go up and down based on what we talked about? Cost and price for clarity. How much does vendor charge? How much do the customer willing to pay? And that sort of thing. We also need to have the item category, perhaps. I think that'll be needed. We'll have to add that to the setup. And then we also have one of the things that we talked about is we're going to need to figure out our research tree. We had talked a little bit about research bots unlocking different things. Well, to me, unlocking the different classes and then potentially unlocking the different item categories are definitely something that need to be mapped out. And so these master company items, we will need to set the research prerequisite. What needs to be unlocked for these to be available? Okay, and then I think that's a lot of the big things. We are making it possible for the player to see customers and see vendors, but we're not going to allow them to do much of anything with either of those. We are going to allow them to see items, but for the time being, I think we are going to not allow players to do a whole lot with pricing just yet. We may find ourselves towards the end of this process deciding that we are going to allow players to adjust pricing, and that the further they deviate from the market price, the more demand rises or falls. That could be an interesting way to handle. It would be awfully fun to have the market price be consistent across all of the companies, and then players have to adapt their pricing to match. Either maybe they set their prices and now it's much too low and they're losing money left and right, or they set their prices and it's much too high and their sales have slowed down. I think that has a lot of value, so let's note it down so we don't forget it. Market value. So in the master company, per item, demand-based pricing, and so that might be actually a lot of fun now that I think about it. So for items, player can't create, obviously, but unlike the customers and vendors, they can control some settings. Which settings should they be able to control? Well, I like the idea of here in the item card, we have the ability to decide replenishment. Yeah, I believe. Double checking. I always forget which fast tab things go under. No, I wanted planning. Okay, here under planning, we can potentially set what is the reorder point, how much do we want to keep in stock, what is the maximum. We have some reorder point parameters that we are going to be able to make use of, and that will drive the information for the bots. I think that will be great because we can go ahead and then tell the system we always want to keep, 5 power upgrades on hand, so that as a player lets it tick over in the background, the next time they log in, they now have 5 upgrades to potentially install into some bots. So that'll be nice. So I think let's plan for that crazy pricing. I think that's fun. Let's let them go ahead and have control over the pricing they charge to customer, which will have some crazy coding challenges for us at a time on this. Will affect rate versus variance from market. Ooh, that's going to be interesting. And we'll be able to do some interesting AI-based forecasting then potentially on this. If we have a significant number of manufactured items up here at the top, say for example we have maybe even 100 different items across the categories that players can potentially choose to focus on, we might make it so that the demand on an item that no one else is manufacturing right now, that demand is skyrocketing and you can make some very big money on it. And then players might reallocate some of their manufacturing bots to make those, and the demand will go down, so the price will go down. I think that will be one of the better tests of our ability to hook into things later, so let's do that. It does mean I'm going to have to create a lot of class 2 and 3 items for us to use as our basis point, but that's okay. The other thing, reordering / replenishment. Players will be able to control the reordering and replenishment strategies used for these items. That sounds good. When we get into the making of the orders to actually fulfill the demands on these, we're going to have to go into a lot more details about how production orders are created and posted, and how assembly orders are posted. We'll probably do assemble to order for the most part, but we'll think about that. So there are lots of settings that we're going to have to talk through in more detail of how do they work, and that sort of thing. And for our research tree that we haven't really spent much time planning out, we are going to have to, per each research, we will have the prerequisites. We cannot type. Sure, there we are. List for each research, and then we will have to come up with a clever way to, first of all, obviously description and research point cost, and we will have to, what is the effect of this research? So, okay. Yeah. So, for example, we could have lots of things like increase the operations per day on both bots and the upgrades installed into bots. We could have decrease of power use on bots, upgrades. We could have, we also allowed for the idea of locations to get power-based upgrades, so let's go ahead and do that. We can, now that we understand the workflow around customer acquisition, research could go ahead and maybe find an increase number of customers found, which I think for linguistic sake, let's go ahead and call those contacts. Actually, let's even go further and call them prospects, which is a type of contact. So by marketing bots, I think that's more realistic. Okay, and then maybe we increase the number of vendors found by purchasing. Sure. And let's see, we'll have some big research things that, in prerequisites we could have other research, and I think it would be nice to also have material demand. So maybe the research for some of the newer tech, like for example the assembly, the improved parts items, maybe we have to have a sufficient number of plastic and simple circuits and power components to research the next class. And that sounds fun. So the material demands. Okay, and then the big tech research unlocks class 2 and 3 items, and then I think we'll also have unlocks of item categories within the 2 classes. So if you want to potentially spend a lot of time and effort researching, you'll have a larger product selection to watch the market trending of the pricing for. That makes a whole lot of sense. And then location capacity, items and bots. We have right now in our specification that the locations will have a limited number of bots for each location and fixed set of bins with fixed capacities. So both of those should be upgradable. That would be good. And then of course we'll also want to have unlock of advanced logistics, which is a prerequisite for the manufacturing bots. So that will make sense as a structure. We are going to need to have a place where all that lives, and we're going to have to decide how do those effects get taken into account in different places. So we're probably going to have some master code units that calculate the operations per day and decrease the power usage that take into account not only the bot's base amount, but the researches unlocked and the upgrade kits installed and the researches for the upgrades. That gives a lot of levers for players to vary up their strategy. Do you want to have a wide army of low quality bots? Do you want to have a focused, narrow laser set of core bots? Maybe you want to have a hybrid of both. I think that gives us a lot of the real game balance framework, and this starts to answer what do we actually need to code and inform some of the decisions that we've already made that maybe aren't quite the right fit. They weren't against the specification, but the specification here, the story, didn't really answer it. So, okay. I think this was a bit more of a planning episode than a development episode, but we needed to flesh out our story. We needed to go, what are the implications of all these things? We are going to, as we work through this list, which I think I will migrate into our Google Doc here, which will be checked into the repo, we will bring all of these pieces into that documentation folder, so that way it's all available. There are going to be lots of things that I think we still need to ask some questions about and figure on, like we talked today about. I do think the master company having the demand-based pricing, how we want to have sales push that up and down, like what logic do we want to use on that. That's going to get pretty complicated. I look forward to writing it, to be honest. That one's going to be tricky and fun. So that gives us a lot more clear plans of what we're going to do. Let's take a look real quick to see, just by any circumstance, if I believe I left the job queue entry in an error state, but just as a nice return, possibly a way to end this episode is to see if that is now going to work correctly. It might not. Bot dispatcher. I'm not 100% sure if I've published, so rather than worry about this too much, one of the things we are going to do is, since we know we want to commit after each run, let's also commit before each run. We'll bookend it. So, for example, if the job queue entry has been changed by the job queue, this will commit that change, which I'm okay with. Let's publish that. Once upon a time, we used to have to also restart the services running the job queue. Some cases you're still required to do that or wait a little bit of time. In my environment, thankfully, the publish everything is on one service at the moment, so the publish will affect the job queue immediately. And let's go ahead and set you to ready. And there's our success pretty much instantly. Perfect. So we went a little over, but if we go look at our bot activity log, we should now see here in the log that we have a purchasing bot, and as per our setup yesterday, that bot instance 3 is set to make 4 purchases, and we are not doing that yet, but we are at least getting the activity result we expected from that code unit. If we look back here at our purchase code unit, in the future I would make purchases, and it's coming from the bot instance. So we now have our cheat 007 is running away, or running, not running away. That would be an impressive move for a virtual bot, but we can see that that is now ticking over correctly and all is well in the world. This is now correctly drawing its power usage and all that sort of thing. So Okay, and if we were to do something crazy, like let's go ahead, I want to make sure everything is working on this engine before we move on to doing some of the next things. So, hello stream. Let's throw an error right from inside of this code unit to make sure that that is logged correctly to our error system. We are going to need to tick over the game date manually because I don't want to wait for 15 minutes to see if it, or up to 15 minutes. So let's go ahead, tick that over. Great. And this master heartbeat is what would do that, but if we hop over to our player company, once every minute it is watching for a change of date. And we got an error. What did we get for an error this time? Another one of our charming, you tried to invoke the code unit, but it doesn't exist type errors. Thank you for trying to run while we were publishing. Okay, so we should now have a run just now that succeeded even though we put an error into our code unit. And if we look at the bot error log, we see, bam, we do get the error logged. We didn't put anything in place to write the company name, I don't think. We'll check that. But we do see our hello stream message. So we do have the basic infrastructure in place here that when a bot is when a dispatcher runs the code unit for a given bot instance, even if that instance errors out, the rest of the job will complete correctly, and that will be logged to a table, which will allow us to take action on it, have some visibility to it as a system administrator, and all that wonderful stuff. So, excellent. And yes, I did not log which company the bot error happened in, so let's fix that before we forget at any point here. Company name. Nice and easy. Small thing. Okay, perfect. I am going to, however, remove our manual forced error message here, or at least comment it out, and finish that little bit of publish. So, a bit of a planning episode, but it gives us the roadmap that we need, and we went a little over to at least spend a small amount of time in coding today, and seeing that our work from yesterday is all operational, which now it is. So, fantastic. I am probably going to go ahead and do a little bit of off-camera work. I do try to avoid that, but I'm going to create some of the table infrastructure necessary for the master company items. Not all of it. I don't quite think I want to dive into creating all of these things yet, but what I would like to do is I would like to start to create all the different items I have to invent for proper ability for players to balance against the market. We need probably a few dozen at least in each class, and I would like to put that into the system where we'll make use of it, and we'll when we do get to the point where we're ready to launch Alpha 1, I will create a config package to export all of these settings also, so people can test it out and follow along in their own environment, and that will include a lot of these setup things, so that way people can have private games of this if they want, with the code and with the settings that we're using. And we will make a habit of doing that when we launch each season, that we will release a compiled version of the code along with a configuration package of all of the master game settings. Well, for those of you who stuck around for the extra 15 minutes and for an hour or so of me going, what are we doing? I appreciate you, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow, where we'll spend a little bit more time in the code. Take care, everyone. Thanks for watching.